This conference will now be recorded.
Sorry, Don.
That's quite all right. Welcome to today's clean call. And today we'll hear from Emily Hart, who is going to be talking about teacher research in the climate change classroom. And we'll get to Emily shortly, but before that, any announcements?
Hi, this is Tamara. I am working on developing a survey for in-classroom teachers, the focus of which is to identify avenues for professional development funding for teachers' professional development. I'm not going to be opening this survey until probably the beginning of the school year, but I would be interested in identifying people who would be willing to distribute it to their networks of teachers. So I'll provide more information about the details later, but I just wanted to put that out there, and anybody who would be interested, you can let me know, and I'll make sure I stay in contact with you.
I can do that.
And Tamara, you know I'm in, Wendy.
Okay, yes. Okay, great.
Let's see, Jim Callahan, a couple of things. One is, if people have been following the news of last couple of days, the European elections, basically across Europe, most of the countries, it's very clear that climate change is a very big issue because the political parties that take it up got a big advance. So a lot has happened in Europe, making clear that climate change is very important on the minds of the public in Europe. A second is something out here in the Bay Area is an organization called Watt Time. It's got a $1.7 million grant from Google. What they're working to do is taking satellite data and being able to identify the major greenhouse gas emitters. They're starting with power plants, and they can broaden out with refineries. And so they'll be providing to the public using the satellite data. And right now it's not NOAA satellites, but it's other Copernicus in Europe and others. What we're going to look to do to work with them is helping them on tying that in with education of both at the science festivals and for part of supplementing and helping teachers, keeping things alive and active, giving students a chance for empowerment. But I mean, how do you take that information and connect it to students have a role within that? So I think that's pretty exciting that we're reaching to where we can now, from satellites, identify specific emitters of carbon dioxide, and they're working on methane too.
Can you say the name of the organization again?
Sure. Watt Time, like WATT, space TIM.
Okay.
TIM. Yep.
And just to follow up on what Jim said first there, yeah, that was interesting to see in Europe. And then I don't know if anybody else saw, there was a New York Times article this morning then about all the things that the Trump administration is trying to do to here to counter climate change adaptation mitigation sort of efforts, where the next national climate assessment report, they're trying to push for only looking at models up to 2040 instead of beyond. So let's do what we can here, people.
Yeah.
Any other announcements?
Okay, I have some small good news from Massachusetts. This is Jane Heinz Fry. And moving toward NSTA 2020, I now have a 7th and 8th grade team of middle school teachers at one school that are looking at developing their climate change approach in their science classrooms. And I just gave them the new NSTA book that is out on climate change, and it's a 2-week module, which happens to be exactly what they are trying to develop. So I think that, along with clean resources and a host of other good resources that are out there, should help them along. And there is one high school, regional high school. Their goal for next year for the whole science department is to include climate change in all of the science classes. So I do have people from each of those schools who I hope will be part of the proposal that I put into NSTA 2020 for next year. And I wanted to ask you guys what the status was. We had talked about Clean putting in a proposal to NSTA for a short course. Can anyone update me on that?
I believe that went in.
Yeah, it did go in.
Great.
Yeah, I'd have to search through my email to find exactly the title and abstract. If you want that, Jane, you can email me. But it did go in, and we are planning to be there and have this sort of short course on climate literacy there next year. So yeah.
I think that's awesome, and I'll look forward to staying tuned on that one. And some of these people may be able to participate in that. I'll know that more as the year goes on. So
Great.
thank you for your work on that.
Yeah, and this is Katie Boyd. So yeah, just reach out to, I think I was on that proposal, and then there was a few others of us, Dawn and a few others. So yeah, if you do want to coordinate that as we hear back from NSTA and start thinking about how do we coordinate our efforts there next year, let's be in touch about that. That's great.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it sounded like you were talking about putting in another proposal for next year, but the deadline is passed, unfortunately.
No, I sent this proposal in back in March or April. And
Okay.
so I already had beginning people working with me, but now that is growing. That's what I'm saying. So it's a separate proposal, but it may also end up linking in with what Clean is doing for the short course.
Okay. Sounds good.
And Jane, a question, Jane?
Sure.
Are you the person with this group of
Not hearing
schools
her.
and teachers?
Are other people not hearing her?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't wanted to stop for that question. Maybe there's an audio issue.
I
Yeah, there
think it
was.
might have been something in the background.
Yeah, I couldn't hear Jane talking. I could see she was talking, but I couldn't hear her because it was just noises.
Oh.
Okay.
Jane, do you want to try again?
I'm hearing Jane. I'm hearing Jane.
Okay. I think the bottom line is I'm feeling more science teachers here in Massachusetts stepping up to addressing some of those new climate change standards. And I think that's going to be inspiring to us for NSTA 2020. And now I think there was a question.
Yeah. So Jane, it was a question of would you be the person, or do you know if there's a point person of when great things are happening with certain schools? There's the question of if it's useful, if teachers or schools would like that, are they able to find climate specialists who can assist them, who can give them resources, perhaps come into their school, to enrich and make it, so they don't have to try and start from scratch on things. There's, and so there's that. Is there a thing of a place they're turning to for climate change specialists to support them?
These are people I happen to connect with through professional development work with the Wade Institute for Science Education, and also through a colleague that I've worked with over the last 10 years. So I would say this is more about the kind of work I'm doing is more about person-to-person contact, or people that maybe I met at the MAST conference.
So this is Tamara. The question you just asked is really relevant to the teacher professional learning community around climate change that I've been trying to develop. And so actually, because Jane's right here in Massachusetts with me, I'm going to connect with her on that, but bringing in that not only science expertise, but addressing local climate impacts expertise, meaning businesses and governments that are dealing with issues that are the impacts of climate change, and making sure or trying to make sure that teachers have access to that expertise also is another focus of what I'm trying to do.
Tamara, that's awesome. And we'll connect after this call on how we can move forward with
Okay,
that.
that'd be great. Okay,
Great.
that would be great. Because Wendy, it's related to the focus group that I'm putting together with the help of the teachers that you put me in contact with.
Right.
Great. Any other announcements? Okay, well, shall we go to Emily? So let me say a word about Emily. Excuse me. So Emily Hart studied biology at Smith College and has an MS from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in environmental conservation. And for the past 5 years, she's been teaching biology and environmental science at an independent high school in the Boston area. And her favorite topic to teach is climate change. And she's also a climate activist outside of the classroom. And she's going to be talking about the teacher research she's been doing in her high school environmental science class. So take it away, Emily.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Hart. I teach biology and environmental science at Gann Academy, which is in Waltham, Massachusetts, and it's an independent high school. So, like Dawn said, today I'm going to be sharing about my experiences doing teacher research, specifically on climate change. So during the 2017-2018 school year, so last school year, I participated in a teacher research project where I investigated the experiences of students learning about climate change in my class. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to just share a little bit about teacher research, which is also called action research. So this definition, action research is any systematic inquiry conducted by teacher researchers, principals, school counselors, or other stakeholders in the teaching or learning environment to gather information about how their particular schools operate, how they teach, how well their students learn. This information is gathered with the goals of gaining insight, developing reflective practice, affecting positive changes in the school environment, and on educational practices in general, and improving student outcomes in the lives of those involved. So something important to know about action research is that it's very context dependent. So it's educators, school administrators studying their own practice and their own schools. And so to me, it feels a little bit different than some of the scientific research I've done. And so in 2017, my school launched a teacher researcher team with a mentor who had done qualitative teacher research before and was trained in action research. I had done a qualitative research thesis on science education for my master's degree, so I was really excited to get to do this type of research. And I had been building and designing my environmental science class for 4 years at that point by myself, and I had a lot that I wanted to explore. So related to that, outside of school, I spend a lot of my time organizing for climate action. Right now, in the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of work with Sunrise Movement Boston, which is youth-led and youth-focused. And so I care a lot about climate change. It's something I think about a lot. I talk about it with my friends and my family, and I found that being a climate activist, it really enriches my teaching, but it also really complicates it for me. And so on top of that, climate change feels like it's already a complicated topic to teach. And then it feels like, I worry about getting it right and the stakes feel so high. So because of that, like climate change, as probably many of you know, has raised a lot of questions. So for me, for example, like how do I work with and honor students who deny climate change? Or like learning about the causes and effects of climate change can be emotionally upsetting for students, and how do I help them cope? How do I balance like this rigorous science and the evidence-based learning with these discussions about like politics and justice and feelings that are so related, and I worry about like upsetting parents or families. And then with this piece about being a climate activist and taking climate action, how do I encourage students to do that? Is what types of actions, or should I even be making climate action a goal of my course? So those are kind of all the thoughts that were spinning in my brain when I was starting this teacher researcher project. And I found that doing teacher research has helped me kind of start to unravel what has felt like a big knot of questions. So in my time teaching at this point, I had been, using the clean guidance pages on teaching climate and energy, and really approach teaching climate change by focusing on scientific evidence, which is really important and a really, strong foundation for learning about climate change. But I was coming away from my teaching feeling like my students didn't really connect with the topic or feel empowered to really do anything about what they were learning. And so I wanted to do more, but was feeling nervous that students or families would be upset by me feeling like I'm kind of being more radical or quote unquote too political, like including politics and emotions and action. And so my teacher research project really kind of focused on this, what felt like a choice point for me of like, what is this kind of appropriate balance of evidence and emotion and action that will inspire students to care and to act and to feel connected, without feeling like despairing, and how do all those things fit together. So I kind of broke this for my project down into like 3 research questions. So I wanted to know, how much do my students learn about climate change? Like, how do they feel as they're studying climate change? And what actions, if any, do they take like in or out of class that connect to what they're learning or how they're feeling? So I had this sense that, and I think it's probably because it's been my own experience, that an emotional connection to climate change will kind of help them make meaningful actions in their own lives. But then I was also feeling that too much, um, you know, they might kind of get stuck with guilt or despair or sadness and like some more like negative feelings, and that might actually get in the way of their learning or any action that they might take. Um, and I was also wondering if students might be kind of resistant to exploring climate change with what felt like a more multidimensional approach, or if I might get pushback from families or parents or administrators. So those were the questions that I was interested in investigating, and I focused on my environmental science and sustainability class in the last school year. And so specifically I do a unit on energy and climate change. And that year I only had 7 students. So it was a small class, and it was an elective. So they're all there by choice in 12th grade. And so for the whole unit, I collected student work and journal responses, and I audio recorded all of our class discussions. I also had students and parents sign consent forms, so everyone knew what was going on, because I was doing this project like in addition to my regular grading and curriculum development. So I was particularly interested in, like, I zoomed in on my learning sequence around like climate change and solutions. And so really focusing on, we do the modeling the greenhouse effect simulation, the PHET activity, doing the photon absorption and the greenhouse effect, skipping the glass layers activity. And then we graphed atmospheric carbon dioxide and average temperature data. And so that's actually, I kind of combined 2 of the clean resources and tweaked them a little bit. So using Excel to graph real data. And so then what was new was I added, we watched the film Before the Flood.
Mhm.
it's from National Geographic, and I chose the film because it's visual, and it shows Leonardo DiCaprio kind of exploring climate change as the United Nations messenger of peace. And so in the past, I've had students say that climate change won't affect them or that it isn't happening now. And kind of my thought behind showing the film was to counteract those narratives. And I kind of thought that the visual aspect of the film would have an emotional effect. And since I was curious about emotions, that was something that I wanted to show. And then after watching the film, we did the grid to home activity from the Clean collection. And so each student brought in and analyzed their own electric bill to understand their own personal carbon footprint and then ways that they could reduce their emissions from their electric usage at home. I was curious about how they might react to like measuring their own personal carbon footprint, like taking something that up to this point had just kind of been everyone else, but like how would it feel to make it really personal to them? So in this presentation today, I thought I would share some of the data that I collected, specifically student responses from watching the Before the Flood film and then analyzing their family's electric bill, the grid to home activity. So we're going to look at two students, Yale and Vered, so that's both pseudonyms, and their experiences through their written work. So after watching the film, Yale wrote, "I didn't know that Leonardo DiCaprio was so concerned with climate change. I didn't know that climate change was very much due to fossil fuels. I think it's sad that almost everything we do releases carbon dioxide. We are so reliant on processes that require it that it is almost insane to think about a world where we aren't reliant on it." So Yale, she says multiple times, "I didn't know." To me, that suggests that she seems to gain new knowledge about climate change, and she also seems to connect to Leonardo DiCaprio as a celebrity. She uses, "I think it's sad and it's almost insane." So to me, that suggests an emotional response to what she saw and what she learned. And then her end of unit reflection, she wrote, "I really liked watching Before the Flood. I am a visual learner, and seeing the actual damage of climate change made me connect to the topic on an emotional level. I always think that the way to create change is not through just numbers or data, but rather by reaching people and showing them how an issue is affecting other people." So in this reflection, she's talking about herself, she's talking about her own action. She says, "made me connect." Yale also says the way to create change by reaching people. So this suggests to me a connection between emotion and action that she seems to be making about herself and also even about other people. And then in her grid to home activity, the electric bill analysis, she wrote about her carbon footprint equivalent, 141,580 pounds of coal burned. This is a lot and very bad for the environment. This shows that we use a ton of electricity and clearly need to cut it down. So in her initial response, she seems to, to connect her personal usage, "we use a ton of electricity," to the broader environmental impact, "very bad for the environment." And then at the end, she wrote, "My biggest takeaway was learning what I could do at home to improve my own impact on climate change. After doing this activity, I showed my findings to my family, and a month later, we reduced our electricity usage by $200. I also talked to my family about installing solar panels, and we are looking into it." So to me, her reflection suggesting that actually calculating her carbon footprint and analyzing her family's electric bill, it like empowered her to take some actions and reduce her impact. And now if we look at the other student I chose to look at, Vered, her written work in reaction to watching the film, she wrote, "This was honestly one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. To see the pictures of unspoiled natural habitats, then switch to pictures of decimated rainforests and barren coral reefs was really unsettling, because I realized that that is going to be what nature looks like in the next 5 to 10 years, and it's really scary that we are on the verge of crossing the line into the earth as we know it, turning into a real-life hell." And so she seems to have a really strong negative emotional reaction to the film. She uses the word hell. She says really unsettling, really scary, one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. And so to me, Vered's language really suggests this deep emotional impact in response to the material. And in her end of the unit reflection, she wrote, all in all, I have come out of this unit feeling a lot more informed about the politics of dealing with climate change, but also really depressed and scared. The website that we saw with the countdown to when the Earth's temperature would reach 4 degrees Celsius really shook me because it's in around 18 years from now, and I'm almost 18. So if nothing
I'm
happens to
in the middle
curb,
of this conference call.
Okay. When you're done with that, do you want to come
Yeah,
on in and tell me that?
yeah, I'll
Okay.
come back in. Thanks.
so if nothing happens to curb global warming, then I'll only have another of my lifetime up till now until I have to deal with an Earth that's screwed. So she uses, depressed, scared, really shook me, suggesting a lasting emotional response to learning about climate change. And I do also want to note that there seems to be a little confusion because she writes about the change in Earth's temperature versus like Earth's actual temperature. So that was something that I noted as well. But overall, like some of the words that she's using really to me pop out as like a really strong negative emotional reaction. And then in her electric bill analysis, Vered wrote, our carbon footprint is equivalent to 5,282 miles driven by an average passenger vehicle. It's crazy to think that just through the electricity that my family uses in our house, we've driven the equivalent of across the US and halfway back. Combined with the CO2 emitted by our cars, that would be an even crazier number. So she's using crazy, she's suggesting like an emotional response to calculating her family's footprint. But at the end, and I found this really interesting, Vered said, doing this activity would make people feel ownership of their electricity usage and also feel motivated to lessen their electricity usage for the sake of saving money. I think that is the key to implementing concrete solutions to climate change, showing people how taking action to improve the environment will actually monetarily benefit themselves. And so Vered's saying like make people feel and they, showing people themselves. So that's suggesting the link, like she sees a link between a connection and action, but she's not using I statements. She's not talking about herself or her own family like Yael was. And so to me, this was suggesting that maybe she didn't make a long-term connection to her own actions or her own agency. So what I found really interesting was both of these students, they went through the same learning sequence, but their responses really suggest that they had two really different journeys with this kind of material. So this isn't based in numbers or anything, but I chose to look at these journeys kind of on an axis of two of my research questions. So what actions, if any, do they take connected to their learning, and how do they feel? So I kind of saw Yael as, according to some of the written work we were just looking at, that she's like increased in positive emotions or like feeling towards climate change. She reflects about talking to her family and reducing their electric bill. So that's suggesting action on climate change and kind of a move along what seemed like an axis of action on climate change. But then if I compare what I saw as Vered's journey, so for Vered, her written work seems to suggest that she's has this increased negative emotional response to learning about climate change, saying things like one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen after watching the film. And so she seemed to report a connection to action for other people without seeming to make as strong a connection to taking action herself. So when I look at these two journeys together for Vered, it feels like connecting on an emotional level seems to make her less likely to take action as compared to Yael. And so coming out of this learning sequence, Yael seems to feel empowered and want to take action, while Vered seems to be overwhelmed and defeated by strong emotions. So when I was thinking about what that means for my teaching, I kind of started to see these students as representative of student archetypes in my class that I'm calling the empowered student and the defeated student. So for empowered students, which is kind of what I see Yael as, she seems to have a more positive affect towards climate change and taking action. For this student, it seems like an emotional response empowered her to connect with climate change and to take action. However, we don't really know what will happen to an empowered student in the long term, and like, will she continue to take action? And then for defeated students like Farid, she reported feeling more informed, but suggests a negative emotional response that doesn't seem to have inspired action. However, we don't really know like what might happen to a defeated student in the long term, and maybe she'll take action in the future. And as a teacher, I'm left wondering, did I serve this student well in their learning? And I'm not really sure. So when I look back on my predictions, in some ways, like the empowered student suggests that is this connection in my teaching between like emotional connection, inspiring action, and as well as what we saw with Verid is that it's possible that that emotional connection can trigger negative feelings that get in the way of productive learning and action. So when I look back on kind of my big question around when I, for planning my curriculum and my direct curriculum development of like what is the appropriate balance of evidence and emotion that's going to inspire students to care and act without feeling despairing. What seems to me, it feels like there's an appropriate balance that's different for different types of students, with these potential student archetypes of a student who is defeated or a student is empowered, and it really speaks to me about seeing a need for differentiation within my climate change teaching. And but also makes me think about like what are the other student archetypes in my class, and how are other students feeling, or what are ways that is there a way to kind of see a range of archetypes and that I could prepare for or differentiate for. And then I think another important finding for me is that maybe the students I should look out for and worry about are these potential defeated students. And I think it was a big realization for me is that since I teach this is an elective class, I'm probably unlikely to have students who are climate deniers, but students who are this kind of defeated archetype, how can I better serve them? So of course, like any good project, this one brought up more questions that I'm continuing to think about. So like, what are some other archetypes that I might encounter while teaching about climate change? And how do I better serve them? And then how do I actually differentiate climate and energy education for different students? And then what I'm also thinking about is this role of civic education and engagement. And that's something I've been thinking about because actually in a reflection from Yale, again, she wrote, I think that this unit was one of the most useful units, though I wish I learned about more tools to combat climate change. I know how to individually make small changes, but I want to learn more about the bigger changes people can make to create a larger change. And I just found that so interesting because she was the one who said, we reduce our electric bill so much, but she still seems to feel like she doesn't know what to do. And so to me, like then as a climate activist, bigger changes means political solutions. And I'm thinking about like, well, what does that mean for my teaching? So I thought that I'd share a little bit about this school year, just because I've had a year to be thinking about this project. I didn't do a formal teacher research project this school year, but I carried a lot of what I learned with me. And so I actually did pre-surveys before the unit with my students and to kind of gauge their knowledge and their feelings. And my thought was to see if I could figure out like potential student archetypes before I start the unit. But I didn't get to actually differentiating based on student responses. So that for me was a learning experience just to see what that was like. And this, just for an example, was one of the pre-surveys. And so I asked students like, have you learned about energy and climate topics before? And then like, well, how much do you know? And then I was just kind of really interested in how they felt about it. because I was thinking maybe I could sort them into groups based on how they felt or how they what they were sharing. Although for many of them, they circled almost all of the feelings. So that was where I got a little bit stuck. But I just found this really helpful to see before I started planning the unit. And then I think the other things that I changed this year, I actually dropped the before the flood film. It took up 2 or 3 school days to show, so it took a lot of time. And I do wonder after seeing Vera's response, like, is it too emotional? Was there too much there? And how does that fit into the bigger picture of balancing emotions and kind of evidence? And so I actually did the climate change mixer activity from the People's Curriculum for the Earth. And then the other thing that was really different this year in that thinking about civic education is that it worked out that our climate, which is the organization supporting young people advocating for carbon pricing, they were actually having a youth lobby day right in the middle of our climate unit. And so kind of based on my experiences doing my teacher research project, I felt pretty empowered to just rework the second half of the unit to focus on carbon pricing and lobbying. And we actually went to the State House, and students talked to their representatives. And so that was an experience for me of thinking about, what are these bigger changes and that students might want to learn about, and how do I help them in a way that's like balanced. And so students did share that field trip was a highlight of the year, but I still really wrestled with like how to do it in a way that didn't feel too political. And so that brought up a lot too, although I was really proud to kind of make that change. So when I look back and think about my teacher researcher project and how that's impacted my practice, I think the biggest takeaway is that I just feel a lot more confident teaching about climate change. I saw that my students seemed to be really hungry for solutions to climate change. And so to me, that makes me feel more okay talking about climate action and doing climate action. And they seem to want to talk about emotions and solutions and justice and ethics. And so I actually never got pushback from parents or families, and I still kind of worry about being like, quote unquote, too radical or too political. I'm less fearful about trying new things in a science classroom than I was before. I also wanted to share some of the other things that I learned. First, having a mentor for this project was actually the first time I had someone to talk with regularly about teaching climate change. So while my mentor wasn't a science teacher, it just kind of worked out that he had learned quite a bit before about climate change, and he was someone who was interested in it, and it was great to have a thought partner. And I also really needed his help because he had experience designing like action research projects and the structure. And balancing this research with my other teaching commitments was really challenging. So I think that was a big takeaway for me. It does feel like it's worth it, but it was a lot to manage. And then I think finally, I had a hard time accessing the peer-reviewed articles about climate education because of the paywalls. But even when I could get access, I just didn't have the time to sit down and read like I wanted to. So I was struggling with feeling like my project wasn't rooted in literature, like I felt it should be, but also reminding myself that action research is context dependent. So I do still have the sense that I could learn a lot from research on climate education and communication, but I also learned a lot from my own experience. So overall, despite these challenges, I still think my project was definitely worth it, and mostly for feeling more confident and working with a mentor and collecting data. So thanks everyone for listening. I'm happy to take some questions. I also put together quite a long list of questions that have been on my mind, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts as well. And then on the last slide, I put my email address. I'd love to connect with anyone or talk further. So we can go back to the discussion questions.
Wow.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah. Is it okay if I respond? This is Lynn Sherry.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. This was so such a really, I mean, this sounds so interesting because
Thank you.
I don't know if you know what I've been doing, but I have this film series, Young Voices for the Planet, and they're all youth solutions to the climate crisis. And you bring up all these issues, like there's actually a name for what you're describing your students going through. It's called motivated avoidance. And if you want to read about this in the literature, I actually have kind of a Cliff Notes version of it. I can send you, or
That would be
share with
great.
the Clean Network. But it was a research done in the Journal of Behavior and Social Psychology, really big study, and showed that people, when they're confronted with a problem that seems so troubling and intractable, that they are motivated to avoid hearing about it again. They push it away. They often go into denial, or like what you're describing with the students, they go into a depression. They get into a funk. You know that it's really. I felt, because I'm a children's book author, illustrator, and lecturer, and I've just felt like it really is. I can't stand doing that to kids anymore. I can't stand to have them go to this point where they're in such despair. It just seems psychologically damaging. And so the reason I did the films was that they talk about climate change, but it's not like Leonardo DiCaprio, where after that movie you just feel like going and jumping off a bridge, you know. But with these films, they teach the science, a little bit of the science, but then mostly it's about the solutions, like, you know, kids who are doing an energy audit and save their school $53,000 in energy bills, or a kid who's planted 1 billion trees, or kids who are actually going and getting laws changed. And I love the fact that you brought the kids to the hearings. But I think the way you're thinking about it is, oh, you know, it's too political. You know, am I getting too political? But if you frame it so that it's you're talking about civic engagement and democracy. I mean, in this country, we have a whole history of fighting for our rights, and democracy, you know, is about exerting our rights and responsibilities of being in a democratic society. And it's patriotic, you know, and when you frame it like that, you don't alienate anybody, because it's tying into the very fabric, the roots of what we're supposed to be all about, right?
That makes sense.
And so we actually have a civic engagement and democracy curriculum, and we just got this $90,000 grant from the Heinz Endowment to put on these civic engagement and democracy workshops in the Pittsburgh area. And I would love to talk to you further. I don't want to take up any more time, but I'd love to talk to you further about just, you know, the kinds of reactions we're getting from teachers and what they're getting from students when the way you're approaching it is designed for civics and social studies frame, and it's all about hope and success stories first, and then you can teach the science, but they can hear it because you haven't spiraled them down into this really dark place. So if you want to comment on that.
Thank you.
This is Jim Bray. Emily, that was terrific. Terrific presentation. I would say this: you look at immediate responses from the students, or virtually immediate, in that you've asked these questions over a period of time, but you also need to consider the great benefit your class does for these students on into the future, because regardless of their immediate reactions, I think becoming informed, becoming connected with their own emotions on it is going to have really good tangible effects, 5, maybe 10 years beyond the class itself. You're going to turn them into lifelong learners on this topic, and I think that, as a teacher, of course, one looks at immediate response, but I think you have to look at the long-term picture and all the great good that you're doing with this class.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I guess something I think about, and I'd be curious to know, is anyone tracking over from a high school class over 5 or 10 years, tracking students?
That's Emily. That's a really hard thing to do. I even back in my other projects years ago, I wanted to, where we were trying to impact the thinking of middle school students so that they would take STEM courses, so that they could pursue more science-oriented classes in college. being able to track over a long period of time because of privacy issues, especially with kids under
Yeah.
18, was next to impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment I wanted to make was that, as I told you in my email before, I'm teaching this global climate change class to undergraduate business students at Bentley University. And so these are students that none of them are going to be STEM majors. I mean, they're not. They're all business majors. And so one of the goals of my class was to make the understanding the climate science, because as undergraduates, they have to take a rigorous science class,
Mm-hmm.
but making that relevant to their business careers. So I really looked for examples. Almost every single class started with some kind of connection to business. So actually, for one of my classes, I showed the global impact of climate change on the barley harvest, which
Mm-hmm.
impacts the manufacturing of beer. And
Wow.
and found articles that really talked about how it's going to impact not only the price of beer, but the availability of beer around the world. So this is just an example of a business application. But the other piece of what I'm doing in this teacher professional learning community, I'm really promoting that teachers really try to connect to a local climate impacts issue and ground what you're doing in the context of reaching out to either the businesses or the government entities that are working on dealing with that issue, so that you empower them. It makes it relevant because it's attached to their own community. It gives them the reason for wanting to understand the science, and at the same time working towards addressing a local problem or issue that's related. So that's the that local context and making it relevant, whether it's to my business students' careers. And I did get an email from one of my students right after the last class in fall semester, which told me that she said, I understood about climate change and I understood about my business career, but it had never occurred to me that one impacts the other. And
Wow.
it's changing the way she's going to look for a job and the other courses that she's going to take at the university while she's still an undergraduate. So you're right that each student is individual and it clearly strikes them differently. But trying to find ways of connecting. I have one student from Italy, and her family owns a vineyard. And I had the opportunity to talk to her about how it was impacted. It turns out that the harvest time for the grapes at her family's vineyard has changed by a month over her father's lifetime. He's the one that's running it now. The idea is she would eventually run it. So she's at the business school so she can run this vineyard and clearly understands that there are impacts to that business. So finding ways, I mean, so if you get a sense of what your students' or aspirations are, whether they change or not down the line, but if something that they're interested in now and trying to make those connections to how climate change impacts. I actually had the students think about how identify, because this is a rigorous science class, how you identify some aspect of climate change and then identify a sector or a business that's impacted by it and how should they deal with it to survive. So
Wow.
that's sort of a context for thinking about how you get students really engaged in learning the science, but making it in a way that they can feel like they can make a difference.
Thank you. I was also wondering, I haven't come across like teacher research, published teacher research on climate education, and granted, I haven't looked that hard. But I was just wondering if anyone knew of teachers doing research like this in their classrooms on climate education.
Yeah. Emily, there is a group called EE Pro, Environmental
Yeah.
Education Pro, that's part of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And Martha Monroe from Florida has published some work on what do the best climate change education programs have in common, like how do they work.
Okay.
So there is some good research that is out there. And one thought that I had for you, I love also that you went to the State House. And I'm curious if at your institution you you really enjoyed collaborating with somebody
Yeah.
else that you had to talk with about it. And as you get into climate change, yes, it's the science, and yes, it's a lot of other things too.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if there are teachers of other subjects who might team up with you and they can approach parts of it that are their strength that maybe you feel less comfortable with or you wonder if you're on the edge. Um, but it would give you some support in your approach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to be transitioning and looking for a different job and moving to the West Coast. Um, but I think in like that's like a bigger thing to consider. So thank you. I think that's a great idea.
I do think you'll find plenty of people on the West Coast to work with.
Thanks.
Emily, I'll also mention to you, because I meant to mention this earlier to everybody, but if you're in the Boston area, the Blue Hill Observatory is holding a summer social with at the American Meteorological Society's headquarters on Beacon Street in Boston. With the guest speaker is Governor Charlie Baker
Oh,
talking about
wow.
climate change.
Oh, that's
So that's on
interesting.
June 13th.
Okay.
So those of you who are in the Boston area, if you're interested, I can send you the announcement of it from the Blue Hill Observatory.
That would be
Please
great.
do, Tamara. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Emily, I think your research is it's supporting so much of what people have learned. I mean, you've put as a very specific examples with in your classes. It's much of what we've seen over the last 20 years of the type of you're speaking of real things that are happening broadly, and you put it well on things. I think one of the things that stood out to me is your emphasis on climate mentors. That teachers who are seriously going into the subject and have a passion for it need support, or need the support they want. Right? They're looking at that. I think that
Yeah.
I think that's a very important one. And a question I'm going to make a couple more statements here, but a question I would have is: do you feel that is there more support that you're getting? Are there things that as a network we need to be providing more? I think among the ones, if I've been part of mentor programs, for instance, Lawrence Hall of Science had Lifelines for Climate Education, which we helped begin and have going. That was funded by NASA. But after 2 to 3 years, NASA didn't have any money more, so the program ends, right? So that thing of tracking for 5 years, there's not that many of us who've been tracking it for 20 years, right? What works, what goes on, talking with teachers and things. And that you're saying how much mentors that helps to do things that you can't do. One I would bring up with that is how are there techniques to supplement, to work along with the curriculum that you've chosen and you put in there to assure that the experience is exciting, involving, it's fun. The whole emotional experience is one that is uplifting, right? The science is real. But it's connected. You have a sense of able to do about it. I think another one is you want to point to political policy solutions as being something that students can do. But if there's pointing to a whole array of them, including for those who wish in STEM, right, being engineers or scientists or helping to make changes in things, that gets you a little more in green light territory, because if you're getting into politics, well, that's maybe not something you should be getting too much into. But if you're getting into the flip side of the science, which is these are things that we can do to make our school more efficient and our city more efficient, that's right in the money for and the effect on biology and so on. Anyway, your big applause for your research. I think it's something that many need to pay attention to.
Thanks, Jim. And I think for the climate mentors kind of piece, and in some ways my problem has almost been that there's just so much available and like being part of Clean and like all of the amazing resources, and it's almost just like finding what's available, like what I can access like locally. And there's definitely things that I think it just takes some work. And so I wouldn't say that there's a lack of potential mentors from what I feel. It just is almost like kind of wading through all the awesomeness to find it. Um, has
That's one of
been.
the aspects of this teacher
Yeah.
professional learning community is to provide you as an individual teacher, a community of teachers seeking climate change that have access to the expertise but support each other in addressing things. So as you're teaching something, you can really draw on this community that's already been trying to teach those topics also.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes a lot of
so
sense.
that's and then as Jim pointed out, when things are funded by a federal agency, the money goes away. The other aspect, and this gets at the survey I talked about in the beginning, is to find an avenue, a business model for funding this kind of activity in an ongoing fashion, rather than being financially viable in longer term than episodic kinds of professional development. So those are two aspects of things I'm trying to address.
Yeah, and I think a lot of mentorship happens informally as well. Maybe
Mhm.
at your school or with a friend or things like that. And so that's a lot, there's more, it's harder to control that or to control for it.
And Emily, a question with mentors, does that also include people who can actually assist you to, I mean,
Mm,
that you don't have to be, you don't have to you don't have to buy your own resources, or
mhm.
you don't have to do everything. That there's people who can help or come in to be a guest speaker or a guest the example we do is we help to make sure you got hands-on science and solutions, that it's
Mhm.
engaging and fun, and you can but to know how to do that, K-12 teachers, just that's a lot to learn, right? You
Yeah.
can have that. But I mean, that's a kind of mentors thing. By the way, if you come out to the West Coast, you'll have a lot of support out here. That's
Thank
what we have.
you. Thank you.
Hey, Emily, this is Patrick. I hope my audio is okay. I apologize if it isn't.
That's
Um,
great.
there's a lot of points in your presentation. I really appreciate it. One thing I wanted to touch on though was I think it's an interesting question to consider how we can allow uh, for that climate grief and that fear and frustration to be expressed in a way that feels supportive to students and create
Yeah.
a space that allows us to do so in classrooms. Some of the work I'm involved with right now is focusing on that, but I think it's a question we need to start to look at and answer, because that fear, frustration, and grief is very real, and there's not a lot of spaces that students have to honestly express it.
Yeah, that's so, so true. And this school year, I did a little bit. I think I had one day where we just kind of talked about it for a while, kind of just without any planning for it. It just kind of happened. But that's something I think about too, of like, you know, when you really know what's going on, yeah, it's sad. And so how do you help students cope with that?
Yeah, and this is Don. I want to follow up on that theme too. I think we worry appropriately a lot about leaving people depressed and feeling powerless, but at the same time, and this was brought up too, we're not very good at getting long-term data on how programs affect outcomes, educational programs, and I have to wonder some if the short-term part of depressing people has mostly negative outcomes, but I wonder
Mhm.
if longer term that becomes less true.
Mhm.
And part of my thinking on that is when we look back at movements in the past that have been effective in various ways, like the uh, World War II or the civil rights movement, I think people got really, really scared and pissed off and angry and terrified largely before they did anything. And I think we talk a lot about not scaring people. And I think if we look at examples from history, we might be making a mistake when we say not to scare people. And that doesn't mean do it willy nilly. But I think if we can, what the sort of framework that I've been dabbling with sketching out is astonishing people and then terrifying them with that astonishment, and then figuring out how to build hope and courage
Mm-hmm.
in the face of being scared.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do have to wonder, when we look at the historical examples, if we're making a mistake when we say don't scare people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Emily, the other thing that I is the student that I forget what name, the student who seemed to be much more depressed.
Yeah.
I didn't in the short things that you showed, I didn't read into it as much of depression as you did. I was thinking more that, you know, they were thinking of things that other people could do, but in going along with Don's suggestion, it might be something that they incorporate for themselves moving forward. It didn't say, it
Yeah.
didn't suggest to me she wasn't going to do anything.
Right.
That these were just things that could be done, and she has plenty of time to think about how she might want to address it. But she's got those ideas.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think, and it just, who knows what's going to happen in the future for those students. And I think too, like, are my goals that they all become climate activists? Well, kind of, but not really. Like,
So you can't depend on that. People are going to, I mean, one of the points I make to my business students is I don't have any deniers in the class, but even if I did, there are issues, there are impacts of climate change that even if you don't think man is causing it, your business or your company is going to have to deal with, your community is going to have to deal with. So you have to do something about it.
Yeah.
Sort of that's a sort of a way of thinking about it too. It's not, they're going to have to deal with it in some way.
Yeah, that's so true.
But Tamara,
So they don't all have to be activists. They just need to think about how they might want to deal with it, whether it's on the activist level or a personal level or community level.
But there's another point, Emily. This is Frank at NOAA.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation and work. But I think there's a truism that we're exploring in this space, is that most people underestimate how much progress, big structural collective progress we're making on this issue. We misunderstand where we are on the story. We think we're at the beginning of the journey. Like, we need to begin to take action. And when you really dig in and look at what people are doing to address this issue, if you really carefully and deeply look, there's much more action and big size action than we understand. So we misplace ourselves on the story, which I think reinforces the despair when you really think about the magnitude and the impact potential. But I also totally agree with Don's point. But I think the last thing I would wonder here, and it's something we've looked at often on this topic, is the amount of time our students need to really deeply understand and position and question and reflect and explore is not adequate to the task at hand. And I think that opening time with our students on this issue so they can really get the full breadth of it is a challenge that we are still struggling with. So I think just being comfortable with that reality, and then because you're dealing with juniors and seniors, I'm assuming?
This is actually only seniors.
Right. So what happened before is not your responsibility, and what happens after, nor is that, right? So like this is a much larger learning process than any one teacher can take, the full, like, we can't transform them in one unit or 1 year. It doesn't work. That's why the NRC, learning pathways work is so awesome, because you're really looking at that. And the last thing I'll say is some interesting research that Deb Morrison shared with me from Washington State about transformational learning. This idea that you learn something, and then as a result of it, everything you think about and learn from after that is changed.
Wow.
So inflecting the vector. And on this issue, I think is a completely relevant and important concept to think about. You change the
Definitely.
direction of people's lives.
Hey, Frank,
Thank
can
you.
you find that out on the list?
I have not found where that literature is, but the concept, Deb was like, oh, you mean transformational? She does this to me all the time, where she says, oh, transformational learning, that's what you mean. Like, I'm just practice tells me this,
Right.
not theory. And she's like, oh, that's transformational learning. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, thanks. That was really helpful. So
Okay.
Oh, there's actually, Frank, we in the Lens on Climate Change project, we have used an instrument to look at how transformational the learning is in our program. And we are using the resource from, I think his name is Frank Pugh. And he has written a lot about it. His key paper is from 2010. He's at the University of Northern Colorado, and he looks at these levels of transformation where he says, you know, you learn something and you think about it in the classroom, and then you go out of the classroom, all of a sudden you think about climate change in other contexts and you talk about it in climate change, and then you action. So that's kind of the trajectory of the transformation.
wow, cool.
Sorry, I just want to jump in here and just say we're definitely way over time. So if we could continue this conversation on the email list, that would be great. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. My email is at the end of the presentation, so I'd really love to hear more if you want to talk more.
Could you just tell it to us now for those of us who
yeah.
aren't online?
Yeah, it's Emily, EMILY, Rose, ROSE, Hart, HART, @gmail.com.
Okay, wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
Bye.